Thanks for coming out tonight. I'd like to welcome you to the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. My name is Carolyn Thompson, and I am the Assistant Director here. And I would like to introduce for you Tate Jones, our featured speaker this evening. Tate is a Missoula native. He has a Master of Arts in History from George Washington University. He is also the Executive Director for the Rocky Mountain Museum of Military History and is the Vice President of the of the Northern Rockies Heritage Center. And both of those facilities are located here. So welcome, neighbor.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for coming out on a very hot night. Now, let me just start with a couple of announcements before we kick off here. And again, I've got a brief slideshow, and you're welcome to chime in with your own additions as I move through. These are basically the best of the photos from the book, and I'll be happy to take some questions and have some discussion afterwards. But before we get started, regretfully, Dr. Bob, this will be his final 4th of July for a bit anyway, because next year he tells me that he's going to Prague for July. So that is definitely a big loss to all of us, but not to worry entirely. I've been on the phone with Dr. Havel from the Czech National Museum, and the first week of July, they are having a museum festival in Prague, and he said he would very much like to have Dr. Bob's help, and especially they're interested in starting a cheese curds booth there. So bon voyage to the Czech Republic, Dr. Bob. Secondly, in case you haven't noticed, the 4th of July is coming up here at the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. And of course, it'll be the big festival it always is, so please come out here on July 4th. There'll be the steam tractors, I understand, will be here, the silent auction outside, the old-fashioned celebration here in the gazebo, and all sorts of great things will be going on. So please come out here for the 4th of July and enjoy the festivities then. Prior to that, on your way out tonight, you'll notice Hayes Autopolic is busy on the Military Museum's lawn across the way here. We have taken delivery of our 1863 Civil War ordnance gun used by the New Jersey State Militia, and during the Civil War, and he is putting the final touches on the tube tonight, the black paint on it. And we will have it out on the lawn, and we will debut it this coming Sunday when we present the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. We'll have a map talk on Gettysburg, and the gun will be on display in the front lawn for all to see. And he says he's going to test it out, and he might try a black powder charge in the tube. And we'll see if we get to use our authentic 1863 Civil War medicine kit. So it'll be fun for the whole family. Please come out. Please come, one and all. That's Sunday, 2 o'clock, June 30th, the eve of the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. But let's move forward a few years now to 1877, and I'll just walk you through some of the best of pictures from Images of America, Fort Missoula. This project had its genesis about 2 years ago when I went to a museums convention and stopped by the Arcadia Publishing book and found out what they did. Arcadia is a publishing house in South Carolina that has published 8,000 titles on local historic sites throughout the U.S., so I am truly unique in that regard. And they were interested in a book on Fort Missoula, so I signed a contract and I was off to the races, and the end product is here tonight, if you'd care to pick up a copy on your way home. This is the best depiction of what Fort Missoula looked like in 1877 that I've been able to locate. This is actually taken in 1910, around between 1910 and 1915. Actually, this is prior to the Joseph Dixon construction, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And this is kind of the end of the frontier post right here. You see Missoula's development. Missoula is nowhere near the fort yet. But this is as near as we've been able to approximate in a photograph of what the fort looked like when the Captain Ron's garrison arrived here in 1877. So 1877 arrives. It's pretty well enshrined in local folklore now that Fort Missoula is established in 1877 for two reasons. One, there's a nascent fear that Indian trouble might erupt with the Salish and Kootenai at some point. Secondly, the local merchants want the contracts that the fort's going to be able to provide and give the local economy a shot in the arm. There had been a major Indian war in Washington state just before the Civil War in the late 1850s. Colonel Steptoe's retreat is the most memorable action that took place during that. So it wasn't entirely beyond the realm of the possibility, although tensions with the Salish never came to the point where the fort was needed in that capacity. One thing that we do neglect to mention sometimes is until the 1890s, there's concern that the U.S. and Britain may go to war again, hence the need for a chain of posts along the northern border, stretching from the Great Lakes westward to Washington state. And Missoula is a natural strategic location for that, essentially controlling the primary route between the Missouri and the Columbia rivers, the Mullen Road and so forth. And General Sherman, when he visits here in 1877 and again in 1883, makes special note of Missoula's strategic location in his writings. So the geographic justification is there. Well-known Colonel Charles Rawn and two companies from the U.S. 7th Infantry, headquartered at Fort Shaw near Great Falls on Sun River, arrive here in June of 1877, begin construction of Fort Missoula, and then almost by accident are swept into the Nez Perce War, which erupts in Idaho that summer. And the story of Fort Fizzle and the story of the Big Hole is well known, well told at this point, and that is essentially the only time Fort Missoula is called into service during the Indian Wars. A trio of structures from early Fort Missoula, construction resumes in 1877 after the Nez Perce War. A trio of structures are essentially the legacy of frontier Fort Missoula. There is the powder magazine down at the corner there, the non-commissioned officers' quarters out here in front of the Historical Museum, and this building, which was originally a barracks in 1878 and eventually converted into the laundress's quarters and ended up as the Officers' Club. And its location was generally over there just across the street from Heritage Hall. And this is what the building looked like again in 1910, around the 1910s. You can see the telephone posts up, so definitely not a frontier era structure. But this building made it through quite a bit of Fort Missoula's history. So, earliest extant photo I've been able to locate of the early fort, or actually of Army presence at the fort. This is Officers' Row. Yeah, maybe this looks a bit better twirled around there. Yeah, a little bit clear. Old Officers' Row, and this is what the fort looks like as of the mid to late 1880s. A woman out of Michigan Tech who's done an extensive study of military architecture says Western forts were accomplished in basically three phases: the early log cabin settlement period, and then as women and families arrived, the attempt to create more of a village green type feeling with this more advanced frame architecture, and thirdly, as the turn of the century approached, an attempt to put together impressive looking posts that reflected America's rise as a world power, essentially trying to advertise the new importance of America's armed forces and America's place in the world. So here's phase two right here. And this is Old Officers' Row. It's for those of you unfamiliar, it was paralleled by the sidewalk that kind of leads out of the amphitheater area and heads over towards the east, over that way generally. Old Officers' Row stayed around a long time, up to the cusp of the 1960s. I know at least one retired University of Montana professor who used one of these houses has professor's housing after World War II when there was a housing crunch. So these stayed around a long time until the local insatiable need for secondhand lumber got to them, and they came down by 1960 at approximately. So the unit here is the 2nd Army unit. The 7th Infantry is here only very briefly. They're gone by 1878. They are replaced by the U.S. 3rd Infantry, also known as the Old Guard, and they are the unit which runs Arlington National Cemetery and mounts the guard at the unknown soldier's tomb today. And they were here approximately 10 years, until 1888. So the 3rd Infantry stays until 1888. Now, again, Missoula loves the 3rd Infantry. The Missoulian covers the 3rd Infantry to death, their social doings, their comings and goings, their maneuvers, and so forth. They get lots and lots of ink in Missoulian. Then, in 1888, the Missoulian announces they're leaving. They are to be replaced by African-American troops. And the Missoulian essentially, for several months, falls in completely silent on what's going on at Fort Missoula. So definitely, there is an element of post-Reconstruction dislike the fact, possibly, that through the Missoulian, expressed through their editorial silence, that the city doesn't like having African-American troops foisted on them. But they can't complain very loudly. If they complain very loudly, the War Department's always looking around for excuses to close down redundant frontier forts, and there goes the money, the contracts, and the paychecks, and all the good things coming from the fort. So there's a kind of a deep freeze for a while, and then, interestingly enough, in comparison to much of the rest of the country during the post-Reconstruction era, there is a thawing of race relations. The African-American troops, the 25th Infantry, are found they can bring certain amenities to Missoula other cities don't have. They have an excellent band. They play baseball. They give local teams an outlet for their athletic aspirations. And Reverend Theophilus Stewart, right here, these are the white officers of the 25th Infantry. Reverend Stewart, an African-American, was the chaplain, is a rather accomplished writer and author. He later writes a book entitled 40-Some Years in the Gospel Ministry. And he is really essentially a pillar of the African-American establishment here at Fort Missoula. And he writes articles from the Missoulian. He desegregates the Florence Hotel when he shames them. He writes an editorial to the Missoulian with the full backing of his commanding officer that says, "I was turned away one night at the Florence Hotel on account of the color of my skin. The Florence is extremely embarrassed. The city fathers probably bring pressure on them to to change their ways, and they announce there's no more color bar at the Florence Hotel." And that's that for the time being. So the 25th Infantry starts to kind of work its way into the affections of Missoulians, and when they leave for the Spanish-American War in 1898, there is a huge send-off on Higgins Avenue for them. A parade, speeches, and just all sorts of hoopla. So an interesting story that was not replicated too much in post-Reconstruction America during the 19th century. All right, one of the gems, and Stan Cohen had a lot to do with finding this. For years, we thought the only picture of Mark Twain in Missoula, and he visits 1895, I believe. Twain visits Missoula in 1895, and he is invited out to the fort for a day to visit with the officers and men out there. For years, we thought the only extant picture of Twain was the back of his head, showed the back of his head. The Center for Mark Twain Studies at Elmira College uncovers this, I think, just a couple of years back. And so this is now working its way into general circulation. This is Mark Twain right here. And this is Colonel Andrew Burt, or as the newspaper of the Missoulian called him at the time, Gallant Andy Burt, the commander of the 25th Infantry and the one that led them in the Spanish-American War. And Twain, interestingly enough, had rather negative views on the Army and the military. He'd been a Confederate volunteer for about a week in 1861, and then he marched around for a week, didn't accomplish very much, and they caused the accidental death of a civilian. His irregular unit did, and he kind of got sick of the thing and lit out for the California gold fields. And he was not a fan of the American imperial era. He thought that the interventions in Cuba and Philippines were a big mistake, and he wrote very vehemently against them. But he did like Fort Missoula. He enjoyed the officers and he enjoyed the men, and he corresponded with the Burt family for some years afterward, after his visit that day. So indeed, he was very much taken with the place.
Where is this picture?
This is Old Officers Row. The clue is the white picket fence right here. These show up again and again in pictures of Old Officers Row right here. So this is probably in front of Colonel Burt's quarters. Okay, accelerating ahead here. The 25th Infantry, of course, leaves for the Spanish-American War in 1898, and the landscape changes for the U.S. Army afterwards. Now the action for the Army is basically taking care of America's imperial responsibilities, Cuba, the Philippines, the Panama Canal Zone, and they're really trying to get out of these frontier forts, which have long since served their purpose and are really now something of a drain on the War Department treasury. So Fort Missoula is constantly under threat of abandonment, and going through the Missoulian archives, it's interesting how much of a multi-generational project it was for Missoula's business establishment to keep Fort Missoula in operation. They begin in 1877. There's a constant fight to promote Fort Missoula over Fort Harrison as being in a better location. They say, oh, people get fewer diseases here, the water is better, and all that. And this goes pretty much all the way into the 1960s. This is handed down from father to son in the Missoula business establishment. Keep Fort Missoula open at all costs. Beg, borrow, bribe, go to the congressional delegation, yammer in their ear till you get what you want, but keep the fort open. And they are essentially very successful at it for the better part of a century. So nobody does pork barrel like we do in Missoula. So anyway, during the 1910s, the fort is pretty much in search of a mission. Basically, the pattern is we get an infantry unit here for a year, maybe 6 months, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. Then there's some flare-up in the Philippines or down on the Mexican border, and they're called away. So there's constantly troops coming and going during the 1900s. As I mentioned when I was talking in Stories and Stones a week ago, pretty much the big feature of the 1900s at Fort Missoula is the fact that we have a saloon strip operating down here, down by the Buckhouse Bridge. And basically it's too far from the municipal authorities to police. It's off the military reservation, no Army authority. There's a mixture of alcohol, prostitution, guns, gambling, all thrown into these miserable little shacks with close quarters. And troops from Fort Missoula during the 1900s are constantly getting into trouble at this place down here. They're coming back. There's stories of soldiers shooting civilians, civilians shooting soldiers, soldiers shooting women of the night shooting soldiers, stabbings thrown in on occasion and all that. So essentially by 1903, 1905, the officers at Fort Missoula, in keeping with the general tenor that the Army is no longer essentially it is no longer what it was during the frontier period, essentially a catch-all for people who couldn't make it in civilian society, but rather they're trying to now promote the prestige of the institution, and because America is now a growing world power, and this is one of America's prestige institutions. Keeping with this tenor, the officers at Fort Missoula go to the county commissioners and say, we're really tired of getting our men cut up and shot in these places. We can't do anything about it. We have no authority, but really it would be in your interest to do something about it if you want this place to continue. So the alarm bell goes off for the county commissioners. Fort closure, can't have that. So they essentially bulldoze the saloon strip down by the Buckhouse Bridge, and the proprietors are told to take their winnings and please move along elsewhere. Wallace, Idaho, or something like that. And that's, from then on, the troops come downtown for their fun.
There's a photo in town here, and I can't remember where it's at. It's one of these ones that has been put up at some business someplace, but it's a, Western style shack building with an artificial front. I think up top it's painted like 4X change. And then there are like 8 or 10 what appear to be soldiers in front of this thing holding beer mugs.
Where's this at?
I cannot remember where the photo's at. Somebody's got it up in town here, but that'd have to be one of the buildings that.
Possibly. I'm surprised anybody spent money on camera and a film to document this place, but that's kind of a luxury.
That was the question I was going to ask you. If was there a little community like right outside the gate that
Near as I've been able to pin it down, Buckhouse Bridge, and my best sources for that whole area are the McClay family, and the elder McClay says he thinks it was on the north side of Buckhouse Bridge.
Well, if I remember where that photo is or come across it again, I'll have to
please contact us.
Contact you.
So, in any case, the saloon strip is bulldozed, troops go downtown for their fun, and there's still a requisite amount of soldier on civilian and civilian on soldier violence, but it's much reduced, and now it's down in a policed area, down in the, very good.
So we do have it in a postcard.
Oh, great.
It's called the 4 Mile Exchange, a saloon located south of Fort Missoula and patronized by the enlisted soldiers circa 1908.
Oh, okay.
Very good. I did not.
And I don't know where, somebody's got that posted, somewhere, maybe one of the grocery stores or something in town.
Yeah, possibly.
So.
Yeah,
But in any case, now the soldiers' paychecks for their sins will now flow to the respectable members of the downtown business community, as opposed to
So is the trolley out here at that point? How are they getting into town? How does the trolley arrive out here?
For the 1900s, basically I hear references to wagon loads of soldiers being picked up from the jail and toted back to the fort. So the trolley, not quite yet. I do have somewhere at some point I'll bring out a story of the trolley in which a soldier was coming back from town, apparently liquored up and riding across the trolley across from a farmer, and tells the farmer, I'm going to beat the tar out of you. And then the farmer pulls out a revolver and shoots him right through the head. And it's ruled justifiable homicide. So cue the happy ragtime music. Okay. So anyway, Fort Missoula, here's the laundress's quarters right here, I showed you earlier. This is approximately 1910, and what happens is Senator Joseph Dixon, who is a friend of Theodore Roosevelt, and a Republican progressive here from Montana, decides around the late 1900s he's going to push for a more permanent establishment and a state-of-the-art post at Fort Missoula. He pushes a big appropriation through Congress, and the War Department says okay, and it goes to work building the state-of-the-art at the time, and essentially they made the jump from essentially log cabin living to buildings with hot and cold running water, central heat, dormitory type living, and so forth. And these buildings, the Dixon Edition, start going up at Fort Missoula, and they are spending so much money on this place that a nickname sticks for a while. I've been trying to revive it, that this place is the $1 Million Post. So this is all the result of Senator Joe Dixon's work right here, and as of 1914, Missoula finds itself hosting a state-of-the-art military base here at the fort. And from what I've been able to trace of its progress so far, interestingly, this wasn't controversial in the papers. People were generally supportive of it. I never saw any opposition to it that I've been able to find so far. And there's so much going on in town at the time, though, with the growth of the university and the railroad's expansion, the coming of the Milwaukee Road. This is kind of a peripheral story. It's covered in the Missoulian, but not really in banner headlines. So it's interesting. This was just moved through very quietly and just exploded one day on the landscape.
Tate, what are the buildings off on the left there?
Okay.
Not the big ones.
Laundress's quarters,
right.
Barracks block, the chapel, which is, of course, is subsumed into what would become the headquarters building, Building T1. Old Officers Row right here, and New Officers Row back here.
So you've pretty much got all 3 phases.
Yes, yes, quite a legacy. No. We'll skip over World War I very quickly because, again, from 1898, there's no permanent garrison in terms of a unit that's kind of sinks local ties. There's some are here up to about 3 years at most, but they don't have the same community relationship that the 25th Infantry did. And we go all the way to 1921 without a permanent garrison. During World War I, we have the Army Mechanics School here. The school and the university get together to train automobile mechanics. There's an influenza outbreak, of course, nationally, and some of the soldiers here die from influenza, buried up here at the Post Cemetery. But as for photographs from World War I, there's a fair amount of people here, but it's a very dark period for photography at Fort Missoula. I've seen just a couple, none of which were really worth bringing out tonight compared to the others. But nothing really of the activity going on here that's come to that I've found to date. In fact, the wartime paranoia is such that the Missoulian essentially editorializes, outsiders don't need to know what's going on at Fort Missoula. And so that's pretty much it for the Great War and Fort Missoula. So 1921 comes around, the Army is reorganizing after World War I, and we finally get, again, a permanent garrison at Fort Missoula, the U.S. 4th Infantry Regiment, also known as the Cotton Balers, because at the Battle of New Orleans under Andrew Jackson, they used cotton balers for breastworks. And they arrive in 1921, and this is what historians of this period call the Old Army, the pre-Pearl Harbor Army, made up of a very small group of regulars and essentially career lifetime enlisted men. And the Army at this point is kind of freed from running kind of what's happening to the U.S. Army today. They're getting kind of freed up from the need to administer large bodies of men and mount expeditionary forces. So they're able to slim down and kind of convert themselves into an advanced school for officers. And this is the environment that MacArthur, Patton, Bradley, and all the great leaders of World War II come out of. So here at Missoula, we have the 4th Infantry Regiment, and this is a mid-1920s scene from the Historical Museum's collections that I've been able to conclude is probably mid-1920s. Notice in the barracks building right here, there's no whitewash on the barracks building yet, so that would come later. And so we have a squad out here doing a morning inspection or a drill or some such activity like that. And this one comes to us courtesy of the Johnson family right here. This is a Brownie shot taken in the mid-1930s, and part of the 4th Infantry are at a place called the Clark Ranch. Does that ring a bell with anyone? Okay. Probably somewhere around here, and they're doing a midsummer road march, doing on maneuvers right there. And the photographer, this might have been, at that time, Lieutenant Walter Johnson. For those of you unfamiliar, Walter Johnson was a West Pointer, and he served here during the 1930s, and he supervised the planting and landscaping of the trees and the landscape around here. Went on to command the 117th Infantry Regiment during the critical Battle of St. Lo in Normandy in 1944. Went on to become military governor of Okinawa and retired here for the rest of his life from the 1970s on. So we're very grateful that he was walking around with a Brownie camera taking some shots of the 4th Infantry maneuvers in the mid-1930s. So, and this is from the Historical Museum's collections. This is, the name escapes me. For a second, I had it memorized, it's gone. This is a private, no, it's in the book. This is a private who took a number of shots of the fort during the 1930s as well, late 1930s, later in the Depression. He was stationed here for a number of years. I think he might have had he might have come back to Missoula as a senior citizen, but his photographs reside here at the Historical Museum today. But this is the Post-Exchange building. This was built before the Dixon construction, 1906, so it looks, we today call it Heritage Hall. A bit more of a classical use of architecture compared to the more modern utilitarian looks of the Dixon era. If you go to the building here, the Post-Exchange, was essentially built as a soldiers' social center. There was a gymnasium inside, an officer's lounge, a library, a soda fountain, and essentially a whole lot of amenities that you would not have seen during the frontier period, because at this point the Army is taking an active interest in trying to retain experienced soldiers, where previously it was simply move them in and move them out and they'll desert, or who cares. So one more note on the Post-Exchange. If you go to Fort Robinson, Nebraska, this was an Army design which could be adapted for local variation. The Wyoming Natural History Museum today uses a building of this similar architecture on the Fort Robinson campus today. They have a number of fossils from the western Nebraska on display, some very big ones. But they have a building similar to this, except that they don't have a big front section with a number of offices and lounges up front. Basically, it's a gymnasium with a few peripheral rooms tacked on. But if you ever on the Fort Robinson campus, take a look out at it and you'll see the comparison and the standard design being used in both buildings. Okay, his name I know. This is from the same soldier's collection. Maybe the name will come back to me. I've used it a bunch of times in the book. This is Corporal Francis Prosper, and he is in the Post-Exchange building, and you see the soda fountain in the PX building. And Corporal Prosper was again a careerist, a career enlisted man with the 4th Infantry. And in World War II, he fought with Merrill's Marauders in Burma, which was the U.S. Composite Infantry Group, which were known as the Forgotten GIs of the CBI, the China-Burma-India Theater. So that's where he ended up after his time at Fort Missoula here, but here in the late 1930s, he's enjoying a soda fountain. I think if you've been in Heritage Hall, this is the basement building, the basement room, which is now across from the room where the historic postcards are kept, essentially the bride's lounge. So from the shelving seems somewhat familiar to me there. So that's the room with the safe in it that we couldn't do anything with because the safe was just too big to move out. So when you're down there in Heritage Hall for an event, check it out sometime. But this is Heritage Hall, Post-Exchange building in the late 1930s. Now, some real showing. These are CCC corpsmen, and for those of you not quite familiar with the story, the Great Depression arrives, 1929. 1933, FDR institutes the Civilian Conservation Corps to try to get young men off the streets of the big urban areas before they rob or murder somebody and get them out in the woods doing constructive work. And Fort Missoula becomes, as I've been told, the largest CCC district in the nation. Fort Missoula's operations essentially encompass most of the state and I think a little bit of borrowing into Idaho perhaps. But ultimately, through Fort Missoula, 45,000 CCC corpsmen are processed, 15,000 of which are from Montana. And this is a set of pictures which was recently acquired by the Military Museum from Joyce Agrella of Polson. And she gave us a scrapbook which has about 50 shots of the CCC previously unpublished in the Sealy-Swan Valley. And this is Camp Goat Creek near Swan Lake. I forget the name of the company, but again, this was one of many summer camps the CCC established to get young men out working, and primarily these fellows were working on road building and campground building in the Swan Valley, right there. So this was how the other half was living outside of the officers at Fort Missoula during the 1930s. Okay, jumping ahead. Let's see. Oh no, we got the World War II to take care of first. Okay. So with so many CCC men here, plus the 4th Infantry, they're still at full strength at the fort here during the 1930s. There's a need for expansion of the recreation space because they're kind of overwhelming the post-exchange at this point. So the Works Progress Administration is called in the late 1930s, and they are asked to build a very large wooden recreation hall. And the site of this is directly south of Heritage Hall. There's a marker up there today. But this, I've seen one shot of the interior, a possible shot of the interior of this, showing the Italian internees on the stage. And no others to date. We have exterior shots mainly to fall back upon. This particular shot came from Bill Sharp, a former CCC man who devoted the latter part of his life toward chronicling life at Fort Missoula. But this recreation hall contained a bowling alley, I think a big pool room, soda fountain, snack bars, of course, and just lots of room for all sorts of recreational pursuits. They start on it in 1939. It is completed by 1940. It serves the CCC only a brief time, about a year. Incidentally, the logs for this come off of from the Gallatin National Forest and are harvested by CCC men. But in 1946, faulty wiring burns it to the ground. So it has a brief but glorious 6-year existence. And primarily during its life, it serves as the recreation hall for the Italian internees here at Fort Missoula. And recently, the Historical Museum acquired a number of photos from a woman in Italy showing the internee's life here, and there's some even nicer exterior shots of the building here. They can't be released to the public domain just yet, but hopefully that'll be worked on eventually, and permission will be acquired to be used. So, twilight of the CCC. Pearl Harbor arrives, and the CCC is disbanded very quickly, and the corpsmen are put into military service. And well known, of course, it's been very well documented by Carol Van Valkenburg and others, so I won't spend too much time on it. But for those unfamiliar, from early 1941 on, Fort Missoula becomes an alien detention center run by the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service and guarded by the Border Patrol. From early 1941, Italian seamen whose ships were in U.S. ports and workers at the World's Fair in New York and just other Italian nationals who found themselves caught in the U.S. are interned here at Fort Missoula. The U.S. isn't at war with Italy for another 6 to 7 months, but relations between Washington and Rome deteriorate, and Roosevelt puts out the order to intern these men. And they are brought here to Fort Missoula, and the story of Bella Vista is well known. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese nationals who are interned on the West Coast are brought here as a transit camp. They are questioned and subject to loyalty hearings here before being processed and then sent on to other camps in the American West and Southwest, Arkansas, Manzanar in California, Nevada, Hart Mountain in Wyoming, and so forth. And they are here a briefer time than the Italians, but this is essentially what the fort does during World War II. It's converted to the Alien Detention Center, and here we have Italians who are out on a work project, probably on a spring or summer day outside the barracks block. As I've understood it, the barracks blocks were used for Italian merchant officers, from merchant marine officers, and ordinary crewmen were sent into that large complex of barracks, which were built to the wooden barracks, which were built to the east of the existing military ones. So definitely more to be gleaned from learning about Bella Vista in the future. There are some Germans here, and I think I should repeat a bit of what I've been told about them in the hopes that somebody might be able to track down more at some point. About a dozen to 20 German internees are here. The story I was given at a talk here by Professor Carling Maloof, now deceased, who was a University of Montana anthropology professor who had been a guard at, as I understand it, during the military prison phase here at Fort Missoula. He was told at some point, and he related to me, that the Germans held here were from North Carolina, German POWs, and that they had been defecting to the Allied side and giving the Allies information on U-boat operations, since apparently some of these were former U-boat men. And that they were moved here to Fort Missoula to separate them out of the German POW general population to keep them safe. I have no documentation on that other than what Carling Maloof relayed to me, but I'll keep it out there in the historical bloodstream, and maybe somebody will be able to prove or disprove it decisively at some point when somebody gets to the National Archives and does some research on that. So, yeah.
About what year are we talking about?
Oh, this is probably 1942. 1942. Eventually, Missoula and western Montana are labor hungry, and any fear of the security threat the Italians pose is very rapidly subsumed by the fact that this whole area needs able-bodied men to work in the sugar beet fields and the lumber industry around here. So almost immediately local farmers start carping, well, can't we use some of these men for labor? And eventually the INS relents, and a lot of these men are given work release to go out and work for the Forest Service or on the sugar beet fields around here, or downtown in some cases, working as waiters and busboys at the Florence Hotel. So that's pretty much the state of affairs until 1944. The last of the most are repatriated after the U.S. signs a separate peace agreement with Italy in 1943. Some linger until 1945. However, before they're finally repatriated. And of course, if you're new to Missoula, some of these men stayed here and decided to make their lives in Missoula, in particular Alfredo Cipollatto, the grocer, and Umberto Benedetti, a man who worked with the administrative side at the University of Montana for many, many years. So, let's see. Well, before we get into that, well, I guess we could talk a bit about the disciplinary barracks. So by 1944, most of the internees are gone. You have a very large prison facility built here on the fort. And by this point, given the explosion of manpower in the U.S. armed services during World War II, the Army finds itself with a lot of troublemakers that need incarceration. Soldiers who haven't adapted to military life, who slugged an officer, who stole something, or worse, and so you need some place to put them. Hence, the Alien Detention Center is turned back to the Army, and it becomes the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks Northwestern Branch. And that's what they do here from 1944 through 47. The Army's troublemakers are sent here, and they're incarcerated in the areas where the Italians were once kept. There's a couple of nasty incidents. There's a couple of there's one attempted escape where one prisoner tries to get across the wire and he's shot by the guards. It's in the book. In one case, one guard is apparently mentally disturbed, and he starts one day randomly spraying machine gun fire around his area, regardless of... So generally, this is kind of the backwash of World War II, and it lasts until 1947. At that point, the Army is rid itself of the people with misdemeanors and minor felonies, and the more hardcore offenders are transferred to U.S. military prisons in California and Leavenworth, Kansas. And in 1947... the Army Service Command running Fort Missoula departs, and that is the last active U.S. Army use of Fort Missoula. From that point on, it is Guard and Reserve forces at Fort Missoula. And nonetheless, the city, for the next 20 years after World War II, there's kind of an interplay. The county has now got its eyes on Fort Missoula. The Chamber of Commerce people are still trying to keep it an active base. There's talk of putting a military airfield out here. The Pentagon, trying to keep as many constituencies satiated as possible, locates all sorts of reserve units out here. We have the Army, Guard and Reserve. We have a Navy Reserve Unit for a time. They're attached to the frigate called the USS Reasoner, home ported in San Diego. We have an Air Force unit that was just recently uncovered by Gary Glynn. In 1962 to 1965, the Air Force was maintaining a unit over in the T1, the post headquarters building. In my book, I have a couple of pictures giving evidence that there was a U.S. Army Air Rescue Unit, which was based here for a time as well. These are all reserve and guard troops with a nominal skeleton staff to look after them until they come in on weekends and for drills and so forth. And even the Marine Corps is here for a while, which I found interesting in my research. I haven't seen any evidence of them except press accounts, so hopefully at some point somebody will be able to bring to us photographic evidence of what the Marine Corps was doing here during the 1950s, 1960s. In fact, they had a tank company operating here. They were using the area across the Bitterroot here as a tank training ground, the Marine Corps was. So that's going on. Missoula County has its eye on the fort, and they have big plans in the 1950s. Missoula County wants to locate out here at the fort what's known as Missoula County Center. They want to bring the fairgrounds out here. They want to put a jail here. They want to put a hospital here. They want to put county offices here, and they really want to go to town and use the property out here. And they're all poised to go in the early mid-1950s when the Army decides, wait, the Cold War's heating up, and the Army has already made procedures to transfer it over to Missoula County. And in the mid-1950s, the Army has gets cold feet about that, and they says, no, we want it back. And so it changes hands back to the Department of Defense. And at that point, Fort Missoula is largely saved for historic preservation purposes. Colonel Joe Golden, who's a noted figure out here during the 50s and 60s, says at this point we should really look at the importance of maintaining Missoula. Fort Missoula has a historic site, and there are the glimmerings of a local historical community, a local historic preservation community getting underway in Missoula. And that's the interesting part for me about preservation in Missoula is we are so outside of the normal pattern of historic preservation. You see, in the Midwest, New England, the pattern is the early settlers move in, the first families manage to grab the best land, and they get going in local industry, and these are the people who start founding and chartering the local historical societies in order to keep a record of their accomplishments. And ergo, the local historical society is born and begins a long curve from essentially Victorian meeting group to its modern format today, the local historical museum with professional interpretation and exhibits and so forth. And the process is helped along in the South, of course, by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who want to preserve the memory of the lost cause, and they take over the local history keeping and so forth. Not in Missoula. It takes us about a century after settlement to get around to really putting a local history into organized form. So we took a very long time about it to get our local historical society and preservation groups up and running. And there was an attempt briefly in the 1960s to put together a historical museum centered at the University of Montana. I visited it a couple of times when I was a first and second grader. They had a room going off in the building where the Brantley Hall, basement of Brantley Hall. They had frontier military equipment and territorial furniture and paintings and so forth, and it was a very good beginning. Unfortunately, the dark times for the university come around in the 70s, and all this gets swept away budget-wise. But not to fear. The cavalry is on the way, or in Fort Missoula's case, the infantry. And in the early 1970s, no.
Yeah, 50-50 shot.
Yep.
Well, you probably have a pretty good idea what I'm talking about. The Western Montana Ghost Town Society gets involved out here at the fort, and they start initial preservation work on the non-commissioned officers' quarters. And spurred on by the American Revolution bicentennial, which was kind of a notable flop elsewhere in the country. There was never any national flagship event to commemorate the Revolutionary Bicentennial. Basically, it became a promotion of the New York City Chamber of Commerce with the tall ships and all that. But spurred on by 1976, local preservation groups went to work, got their eyes on Fort Missoula, and the fact that the Army had stayed so long left a lot of this infrastructure out here in good condition. And by the 1974, 1975, you have a group that's willing to do the paperwork and approach the Army and get this transferred and begin the work of establishing getting a local history establishment going. And the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula gets underway about 1974, 1975. And I remember coming out as an 8th grader to this building and meeting the first director, Jeff Hunt. Feeding his wood stove in the midst of the building. Actually, Stan Cohen was the first director. Jeff was the second. Putting up exhibits on a very rudimentary budget. Basically, this was the Project Mercury phase of the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. And nonetheless, it took off, and the result is around you today. A fully professional and accredited regional and local history museum, the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. And that essentially gets the history community going in Missoula. They have a focus, and we now have a place we can bring artifacts and a place we can do interpretation. And due to a very fortunate combination of circumstances, we have a very well-preserved military post to work on, a campus here to work on here at the fort. So just a couple more here. Okay. In the book, I have several shots of early preservation efforts at Fort Missoula, the bringing in of St. Michael's Church, and the work on the non-commissioned officers' quarters, and basically all the initial hammer and nail work which was done here in the 1970s to stabilize the buildings. And if you've toured other Western military posts, you'll find out this place is very much the exception to the rule. Basically, as soon as these places were abandoned, the local people moved in and started tearing them apart for building materials. So if you go to Fort Selden in New Mexico today, basically it's humps of adobe. Fort Union, more humps of adobe in New Mexico. On the Bozeman Trail, basically what the Indians didn't burn to the ground after the Army left was rapidly taken up by souvenir hunters. So what you see there today are primarily just markers and recreations and so forth.
This fort always reminds me on a smaller scale of like Fort Snelling or Fort Des Moines in Des Moines, Iowa.
Yeah.
I mean, very similar.
Fort Snelling still actively used. That's huge there, and also a lot of it was built out of stone, custom-made stone, which was hard to.
You know, out toward the airport, you know, the
Certainly.
old abandoned buildings. It
Yes.
kind of reminded me a lot of here, you know.
Oh, indeed.
Out on by the parade ground, and then Fort Des Moines in Des Moines, Iowa, same way, you know.
Indeed. Well, let's see. I'm covering just the modern preservation area very briefly right here. My home away from home right here. The Rocky Mountain Museum of Military History. This building was headquarters for the Fort Missoula district of the CCC from 1936 until 1941. Still no idea what it was used for during the internment period. One of my ongoing hunts to find out what happened here during World War II. Well documented, though. General Beau Foster, a local man who rose from the ranks from lieutenant to brigadier general of the Montana National Guard, used this as the headquarters from the 443rd Field Artillery Unit during the 1950s, Missoula's first National Guard unit. We didn't have an organized military unit here between the Spanish-American War and until after World War II. And used as a National Guard battalion headquarters all the way up until about 1980, when at that point the new facility was built out on Reserve Street, and this one was boarded up and left to the tender ministrations of birds, rats, mice, and bugs for about 20 years. Rocky Mountain Museum of Military History moved in 2000 and began restoration, and as of today, the entire building has been restored to public use except for one corner room here, which we're using for storage. right there. But again, this is a building just celebrated its 75th anniversary last year, and hopefully the job we've done will keep it going for a good long time, unless Hayes has an errant aim with the cannon he's working on over there. So to wrap up, one more shot from the book right here. As of 2013, the Army has largely pulled out of Fort Missoula. The trend in recent years, now that the Army is kind of slimming down from the Cold War and again after the Middle Eastern conflicts to an extent, is that they want to centralize and consolidate as much of their Guard and Reserve operations as possible. So now we no longer have separate side-by-side Guard and Reserve operations, each with their own supply facility, administrative staff. They combine them together, and in Missoula this has found manifestation in the new Guard Reserve Joint Facility, which is up by the Y, up just north of the truck stop there at the corner of 93 and Interstate 90. So the Army has essentially departed Fort Missoula. Their barracks block that the reserve unit used to use is now a Forest Service offices, and the modern 1970s armory has been turned over to the Goodwill organization over on Reserve Street there, and they are up at the Y. However, they do return to the fort for occasional ceremonial purposes. This is a part of the 379th Engineering Battalion. They're a well drilling detachment returning from Djibouti in Africa about 4 years ago, and they decided to have their welcome home ceremony on the front lawn of the Military Museum. And we still, well, they're not entirely gone. We still have the vehicle maintenance facility for the National Guard is located just to the west of us over here, and all the equipment they brought back from the Middle East has been parked over in the CCC lot over there, so they will be in the vehicle maintenance facility for what I'm told for some time to come, simply because they have a lot of space there to park trucks and cars and so forth. Although some have suggested to me that they've dumped so much chemical stuff into the soil over there over the last 70 years that it's simpler just to stay there rather than clean it up, so we can live with that. So.
Yeah, that might be it.
And so that's essentially concludes the best of selection from the book. And I'd be happy to, let me get this clicked off there. Happy to take any questions you have on the book.
Tell me where all the ranges were.
Okay.
We've got Target Range, we've got the range up Tate Canyon,
We-
range out at Blue Mountain. And, you know,
We have photograph.
There's a range at Blue Mountain. When I was an officer in the reserve here in the middle 50s, we would go out there and fire the weapons.
yeah,
So,
I mean, I see that every day when I go hiking up there.
Well, in the book, we've got photographic evidence of the one being built out here.
Where exactly, is that by the school there? Or?
I couldn't pinpoint it. I just I always assumed that the Target Range neighborhood name came from it.
There's that cut in the hill behind the school,
Possibly.
and I poked around back in there to see if I can find any lead or anything, but
No.
I've never really found anything. But I suspect that maybe that cut was where the range was. I would think, you know.
Very possibly. By the 1920s, and there's pictures of the book of this, about perhaps by the 20s, perhaps a little closer to the turn of the century, the buildup of farmers and buildings out here put some pressure on the Army to remove that a little bit. Hence, use of the Tate Canyon range begins. And of course, that's all well documented by the Forest Service up there. They have a guided trail you can take and looking at the escarpments and the target areas and so forth. And then Blue Mountain gets starts getting use, I think, from the 50s on. At that point, there's some big stuff out here, artillery in particular. And apparently that's viewed as sufficiently far enough away from the population center that nobody will ever mind what's going on.
You can see
Yeah.
where there were some maybe deflated artillery positions, or maybe they ran tanks down into
Certainly.
these buried positions, and then because they're boom boom. I mean, you can kind of see them right there where they probably had artillery positions firing out over the valley where the
Possibly.
the Frisbee golf course is.
Indeed. Well, the National Guard begins cleanup. Blue Mountain use lasts until the 80s, from what I've been able to pinpoint. National Guard begins investigation and cleanup about 6 years ago. They did a very intensive go-over with metal detectors and found what they could and pulled it out. And if you saw the Missoulian last week, they're now engaged and possibly headed towards litigation with a ranch near Helena. And Bo Foster told me about this when he was alive. He said basically in the 50s or 60s they would load up their trucks, they'd go out and they'd find a rancher who wanted to make some quick cash. There you go, we're going to shoot off some things, have a good time. And that's how they handled target ranges in the up through the 60s. But apparently now in Helena, especially the range that they were using north of Fort Harrison, is now scheduled for some pretty heavy housing development, and so there seems some litigation is probably going to come out of, mitigation is going to come out of that. So,
Point of interest, Tate, 60 years ago today, June 27th, 1953, the Korean War armistice was signed.
there you go.
And for anyone who's been there, I was there after that time, or for that time. And, but it's kind of interesting to know that this is the 60th year of that.
Oh,
that
yes,
time.
yes indeed.
Today.
Well, and if anybody would like to, please come to the Military Museum and I'll give you a 50th anniversary commemorative wall chart of the Korean War. The Korean War 50th Commemorative Committee gave me a stack of about 3,000 of them, so I'm well prepared for the Korean War centennial in 2053. So they're free. Questions?
Well, the other thing about from the work that we've been doing relative to the alien detention camp, which is the entire fort. When the National Park Service was here as part of our restoration of the T1 building and all of that, they were blown away that this camp is so intact, that the fort is so intact, that the major buildings, whether it's the administration building, which is T1, with a courtroom in it, the commissary next door, the former hospital, which is now the mental health center, and the unknown barracks, which is actually where a lot of the Italian guys lived, is now the Forest Service building, which isn't even signed. So the entire fort, it's not just that field out there that had temporary buildings on it, but the entire fort is the most intact World War II internment camp in the United States. And it's very significant for that reason. I mean, the others were built to be temporary and they were dismantled, and this one is still here, intact.
Indeed.
I mean, every building that's out here now was all used. All of them were used for various things, because at the max it had over 2,000 men out here.
As I mentioned in the book, usually the competition between preserving historic military sites and suburban development usually wins. But we do things very differently here in Missoula, to our credit.
When you go down the road between the two golf courses, those buildings there with the little windows, they were like kind of a concentration or prison or something.
The wide sprawling buildings.
Yeah.
Those were the maximum security cells for the disciplinary barracks here. Later on, University of Montana used them for primate research and helps. They got the name monkey buildings and so forth, and now they are used for the University of Montana Drama Department uses them for storage.
You had mentioned the World War II generals. Did Eisenhower, MacArthur, and Patton serve here at Fort Missoula, or were they...
Pershing for World War I visited here once. I have no documentation of either of the big three from World War II, Eisenhower, Patton, or MacArthur, ever coming through here on that. We do have, let's see, further back, 2 documented visits from William T. Sherman and all that. And as far as notable personages here, who's the boxer, famous boxer, Marciano, Rocky Marciano from the 1950s, boxer. he apparently passed through here at some point. That I've never seen photographic documentation of. Not sure if he was connected to the disciplinary barracks, if he was being used as a guard. I don't think he was a prisoner, or if he had some brief connection with the 4th Infantry prior to World War II. More notably, Carol O'Connor from All in the Family was a National Guardsman here during the 1950s under General Beau Foster. And General Foster told me he made a better actor than soldier.
For what it's worth, the Marine Corps is doing a big push right now on their history. And if you were, I don't know, to contact somebody in San Diego, where they recently put up a moderate museum, they may be able to, they have a former Marines organization that they could get with, and perhaps you get photographs from the tank unit that was here.
Very possibly. I'm surprised at this point none of the alumni of that unit have come forward and identified themselves. If it was if it was from the 60s, I'm sure there must be one or two around here somewhere. But the Marine Corps also has a very state-of-the-art, multi-million-dollar historical facility now at Quantico. If you're going to the East Coast anytime soon, drive down to Quantico, and the Marine Corps Museum essentially sprawls over several acres in terms of a brand new building and brand new sense-around displays, dioramas, and very well worth your time. So, can I take any further questions on the book then? Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and please come out here on the 4th and on the 27th. So.